Hello and welcome back to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming. Today we are continuing our unit guide for bolt action, and today we are going to be looking at one of Satan's own creations, and that is the Flamethrower. And I have to say, the rules for this weapon in bolt action are probably more cruel than the actual weapon, as this is one of those weapon profiles in the game that circumnavigates the core principle of this game being about suppression, morale, and command structure, and focuses instead on just deleting whatever you point it at. But let's go ahead and jump right in and take a look at this weapon's profile and how it's going to function on the battlefield. And first of all, we're going to mention a major perk to the Flamethrower, and that is the fact that it has its own slot in the reinforced platoon. It's not competing with things like artillery or anti-tank, which definitely gives it a level of appeal that you don't see on every other support weapon. But here, you are going to be getting a two-man team that is going to come in at 50 points, 65 points if you take them as veterans, who will of course be equipped with one Flamethrower. Now, this is going to be a two-man team, meaning if you lose one model, you are going to have to test for morale to see if they retreat or not. And if you lose the quote-unquote loader for this unit, you are going to be suffering -1 to hit with a Flamethrower. However, there is a major bonus in this unit being just two models, and that is, of course, the fact that they are going to gain the small team keyword, which will confer a -1 to hit when your opponent is firing at them. And this really is one of the biggest advantages you can ask for in bolt action. There are so many scenarios in this game involving actions and hit modifiers, in which just one more -1 will tip it over from a standard 6 to hit to double 6s, which will not only ensure that your unit is very unlikely to receive damage, but also very unlikely to receive a pin in the first place. And that alone is not only going to flat out increase the survivability of this unit, but can even deter your enemy from even trying to shoot at it in the first place. And this will be a reoccurring theme that I will bring up throughout the course of this unit guide series, and definitely something that I think every bolt action player should have driven home to them. Bolt action is a game with extremely punishing dice thanks to those hit modifiers, and any player-based input that can exploit that should be used to its maximum effect, especially in that pre-match list-building stage. But let's get the obvious stuff out of the way here and move along and take a look at the Flamethrower profile itself. And here we are going to have a weapon with a range of 6 inches, and while this is technically a single shot weapon, it will apply D6 hits after a successful hit, which will have a penetration value of 3. So right away we notice that the Flamethrower is very limited by its short range of 6 inches, meaning this unit is going to have to get very up close and personal to be effective. However, much like other small team support weapons like the bazooka, it is a very popular strategy to put this inside a jeep and hurl it towards your enemy, which is a very effective and competitive tactic, but one that is also somewhat cheesy, as it really mitigates the only drawback to one of the most OP weapon profiles in bolt action. But going back to that 6-inch range, you are of course going to be suffering the -1 to hit for long range if you are firing this thing at more than 3 inches, which is about as close as ranged attacks get in this game. However, this negative hit modifier is mitigated by the close range +1 modifier, which means you're never really suffering that long range hit modifier, but instead you have a sort of shorter close range modifier, if that makes sense. And while that's not really a bonus, it is something worth remembering whether you're on the receiving or sending end of a Flamethrower attack, as the Flamethrower wielder may forget that there is still long range penalties, even on a 6-inch weapon profile, and the defender may forget that there is a +1 for being within 6 inches. And if that sounds confusing to you, that's because it is. With such a short range and unique weapon profile, there is a ton of back and forth with positive and negative hit modifiers for the Flamethrower, so brush up on your hit modifiers before fielding this weapon, and get your counting fingers ready. However, before we move on from the topic of hit modifiers, there is something I want to bring up with the Flamethrower, and that is the very common misconception that this weapon does have the assault keyword, meaning it doesn't suffer hit modifiers for moving and shooting. And while I do understand where that misconception comes from, it is absolutely untrue, and Flamethrowers do not have the assault keyword, meaning they are going to suffer a -1 to hit if they are given an advance order and move to shoot, something that is very penalizing for a weapon with just 6-inch range. However, applying D6 hits with a penetration value of 3 with this weapon is obviously a very strong profile, provided you do hit your targets. But there is good news here, as the Flamethrower not only comes with a litany of abilities that help reduce the amount of negative hit modifiers you would usually experience, but also a series of after effects that pretty much ensure the destruction of anything you should hit. And these are all elaborated on in the Flamethrower special keyword, which will be the cherry on top of this weapon's devastating profile. And first up here, the Flamethrower is never going to suffer negative hit penalties when targeting a unit that may be in cover or taking a down order, which means your Flamethrower is almost always going to be hitting on a 3+ or 4+, and your opponent is not going to be able to make any reactionary plays to reduce the chances of them being hit. On top of that, the Flamethrower is also going to ignore the effects of their target unit being inside a building or behind a gun shield, which would usually confer a -1 to wound. After that, we are going to see that the Flamethrower also does not lose penetration value over long range, meaning if you are firing this thing beyond range 3, your 3+ penetration value is not going to drop to a 2, which is definitely advantageous, especially when we look at this weapon's effects against vehicles, as the Flamethrower, when attacking a vehicle, always counts as hitting its top armor, which will confer an extra +1 penetration, upping your penetration value to 4, which against an open top vehicle will of course be increased by 2 instead to a penetration value of 5, matching the penetration value of a light anti-tank gun against standard armored targets, and that of a medium anti-tank gun against open topped vehicles. On top of that, if you are targeting an enemy vehicle that has a Flamethrower on itself, you will gain a +1 modifier when rolling on the vehicle damage chart, which of course is there to represent the idea of you targeting a vehicle that has highly volatile fuel with a highly combustible flame attack. Not a scenario that comes up very often in bolt action, but one that is definitely worth remembering. But lastly, we are going to have the real kicker for the Flamethrower keyword, and that is the fact that any unit hit by this weapon is going to immediately receive D3 +1 pins, and will be forced to take a morale check after the attack. So hey, if you whiffed your D6 roll and only killed one infantry model in that unit, or you failed to penetrate that Tiger's top armor, they are now forced to take a morale check with 2 to 4 pins on them, and should they fail that toss-up, the unit will be destroyed. So keep in mind, in most scenarios, if you're hit with a Flamethrower, there is a 50-50 or worse chance that your models are going to be running off the tabletop. And yes, you will lose 300-point tanks to a 50-point support weapon. And this lathering of pins, followed up by a forced morale check, is really what makes the Flamethrower one of the most overpowered weapons in the game. Yes, it is a weapon that has immense demoralization capabilities, but I think Warlord's decision to add both D3 +1 pin markers and a forced morale check is just extremely excessive. Both of these traits on their own represent the demoralizing nature of this weapon, and layering them on top of each other doesn't really increase immersion as much as it just outright breaks the game. It's far more reliable at destroying units through that forced morale check than any other weapon profile in the game. Meanwhile, its points are at the same cost of a light anti-tank gun, which, ironically enough, has remarkably lower chances of actually killing a tank. And even if your unit does survive the D6 hits and passes the mandatory morale check, they will, on average, then have 3 pins on them, and your opponent's Flamethrower will likely be able to retry the attack again next turn before you can even activate. And yes, if your unit drops below half strength during these attacks, they will have to make a second morale test due to being below half strength, on top of that forced morale check from the Flamethrower attack. So how do you feel about passing a 50-50 check twice? It's extreme to say the least. However, there is one other drawback to the Flamethrower special rule that I have not mentioned yet, and that is, after you attack with the Flamethrower, you must roll a d6, and on a roll of 1, your Flamethrower fuel tanks have run dry, and your unit, now without a weapon, runs off the battlefield and is counted as destroyed. Now, this is resolved after you attack, so if your 50-point Flamethrower unit has destroyed a 200-point tank, or even a 100-point infantry squad, and then you lose it to drain fuel tanks on a roll of 1, they have certainly already put their work in for the match, and you're not suffering too much of a loss as long as the rest of your list is comprehensive enough to finish up the battle. However, there is going to be those games where you miss with your Flamethrower and then roll a 1 on the fuel tank and have them run off the table. They are incredibly rare, but it has happened to my local Wargaming group twice. And at just a 17% chance of this happening after you attack, I think the rewards for fielding a Flamethrower greatly outweigh this drawback, and if this is what enticed Warlord Games to price this unit at just 50 points regular, then I definitely need to have a word with whoever is writing the rules. Almost every bolt action player out there will tell you that the Flamethrower is an incredibly overpowered weapon with the ability to delete units from the tabletop, and is wildly exploited when used alongside a light transport such as a Jeep. And because of that, I want to bring up the fact that my local wargaming group, while we're playing Bolt Action, we have a set of rules that we call the Geneva Convention. And really, the primary rule of this accord is that we all consent to not bring flamethrowers when we play matches of Bolt Action. The exception is vehicle-mounted flamethrowers, which will have their own video. But flamethrowers, with their current rules, are just a little bit too nasty for casual play, and after everyone in our group played a dozen or so games with them, we decided to simply not use them. And I'll be honest, I'm willing to wager that we are not the only casual group of Bolt Action players who have done this. But if you're not playing with this Geneva Convention rule set, or if you're going into something like a tournament or a new hobby store to pick up a game, here's some tips I will offer you for playing with or against flamethrowers. First up is, of course, the very limited range of the weapon. These guys really want to be in a transport, but also they are going to be a high priority target for your opponents. So when you are maneuvering them around the battlefield, be it on foot or in a vehicle, make use of line of sight obscuring terrain and avoid entering the firing arcs of multiple units at once. Of course, if you have a large enemy target, such as a tank that you want to blast off the tabletop, you will likely be hurling these guys at that target in a suicide attack, and that strategy is fine provided you hit your targets, but you really do need to bide your time and strike at the perfect moments to ensure that you can get that hit off or at least get another follow-up hit on the preceding turn. From my experience, flamethrowers work very well with cat and mouse-like tactics where they hide behind line of sight obscuring terrain, such as a building, and wait to pop out to engage enemy targets while making use of advantageous firing and cover arcs. On top of that, I highly recommend taking flamethrowers as veterans. Much like the bazooka team, these are going to be a high priority target that your enemy is going to focus fire and try and kill, but layering that more resilient wound roll of veterans on top of that small team keyword is really going to make them a lot more durable than a two-man unit would appear to be. And if you make proper use of cover and down orders, your opponent will sink a lot of firepower to try and kill these guys, which can make them a valuable distraction unit in their own right. But what if you're going up against a flamethrower? Well, there's only really one unit that I would consider a hard counter to the flamethrower, and that of course is going to be the sniper. It's pretty much tailor-made to rock, paper, scissor, these other support weapons. It ignores all negative hit modifiers, including the small team special rule, and any successful damage from a sniper rifle counts as exceptional, meaning you're only going to have to hit the flamethrower team once and kill the special weapon, which will thus destroy the unit. The obvious drawback here is that your opponent's flamethrower is not going to be dashing across the open of the battlefield, and will likely be either hiding behind cover or in a transport, meaning your sniper may have little to no opportunities to line up a shot throughout the course of a match. After that, the best thing you can do to avoid being killed by a flamethrower is to keep your distance from it and dump as much high-volume, small arms firepower into the units that you're physically capable of doing from a safe range. Once again, this can be difficult if your opponent is playing cat and mouse tactics. However, if the flamethrower is in a soft-skin transport like a jeep or a truck, your opponent is much more likely to be reckless with it, and it is definitely worth dumping every light machine gun you have available into that transport to ensure that it's destroyed before delivering the payload. But if your opponent is playing coy with their transport also, try and gauge the effective range in which they can drive out and then disembark to engage you, and perhaps try baiting them out while keeping other nearby friendly units in ambush, which you will of course spring when the vehicle either moves or the flamethrower team disembarks. Lastly, if you have an infantry squad who finds themselves within close range of an enemy flamethrower unit, it may be worthwhile to charge them and engage them in melee, which you can potentially overwhelm the two-man squad, something that may have more favorable odds than shooting at them. Just keep in mind that they can make a reactionary shot if you are charging more than 6 inches away, and in a scenario where the flamethrower doesn't have a order dice on it yet, it may be worth just shooting at them and hoping to force a down. Overall, flamethrowers can be incredibly difficult to deal with in the hands of a skilled opponent, especially on dense urban maps, and there really isn't one clear counterplay other than to avoid them and hopefully goad your opponent into flushing their own unit out, or to cautiously encroach your enemy's flamethrower team and apply force onto them during a turn where they already have order dice on them and you know you can wipe them out. Overall, it's a very delicate dance in dealing with a flamethrower team, and if you don't do it cautiously, you will lose units to that force morale check. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Do you think flamethrowers are balanced? Do you think they're wildly OP? Are they an auto take in any reinforced platoon? And what are your strategies for dealing with flamethrowers? As always, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like. Consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, as we will continue this series of bolt action unit guides. And until next time, take care.